everyone, welcome to another Teen Crafternoon class. I'm Monica, and this week we are going to be talking about some basic embroidery stitches and how to do them. I got the idea for this class by looking at one of our Creativebug resources, which is a 30-day stitch-a-day sampler by the instructor Rebecca Ringquist. For this craft, really all you need is a fabric, a needle, and some thread, but I have some things here that make embroidery a bit easier and a bit more enjoyable to do. So what you'll need is a embroidery hoop like this. Whatever fabric you are going to embroider on, I have this pre-printed pattern with different stitches on it that I got from Rebecca Ringquist's Etsy site as a part of her Creativebug class. You can use one of those, or you can draw your own designs on any piece of fabric that you have at home. You also need some kind of backing fabric. So underneath this pattern is a piece of muslin that I've been using as a backing fabric. You can also use any sort of fabric that you have as a backing fabric. That just keeps the embroidery tension tighter in the hoop so that your stitches come out a little bit cleaner. You will also need some needles. I have some in this needle holder right here, some thread scissors or regular pair of scissors to trim threads with. You are also going to need some embroidery thread. You can choose whatever color you like. If you have regular sewing thread at home, that will work too. It'll just give you a thinner line. You can use any thickness of thread you like, but I'm using embroidery thread because I like these colors and it's a little smoother to work with. So to start, what you're going to want to do is this hoop comes apart in two pieces. You just unscrew the top, and then it will come apart like that. You will take the side that doesn't have the metal part on it and put it down on the table like this. Put your backing fabric and your embroidery fabric over the top of it. You don't have to sew these together. Mine are being held together by a few stitches that I've done already, but you don't need any sort of interfacing or anything like that. Just lay them over the top and then put the second piece of the hoop over top like that. Once you've tightened it a little bit, you can go around the fabric and pull it so that everything is drum tight. And then you're just going to tighten it a little bit more so that everything stays in place. And that's how you get your hoop ready. To get your needle ready, you're going to pick a needle. You can also thread your needles in advance with different colors so you don't have to keep switching them out. I'm going to take this one and then take what color thread you want. If you're using embroidery floss, you want to unwind a length of thread. And cut that. And then carefully separate out either 2 or 3 pieces of thread. Embroidery floss comes in 6 strands, and depending on how many strands you separate out, that will determine how thick your line is. I'm going for kind of a medium-sized line, so I'm going to separate out 3 strands like that. And I'm going to carefully pull them apart so that I don't tangle the thread. At this point, you can decide whether you want to thread this through the needle in half like this and tie a knot at the end, or if you just want to tie a knot at one end and use that. I think what I'm going to do is just tie a knot at this one end. And then I'm going to take my needle and carefully thread these strands through the eye of the needle. Once you get your thread through the needle, you can just hold it like this if you've tied one end. I'm holding the needle in my left hand, so then you grab your embroidery and you can start embroidering like this. So the first stitch that I'm going to show you is a basic running stitch. It's really easy. What you do is you take your needle and you start underneath the embroidery and you just poke it up through the spot where you want your thread to start, like that. Pull it all the way through. And it should stop where you knotted the end of the thread. Then you are going to just poke back down. And there you can see that we've made one stitch. And with the running stitch, you would just poke back up through the fabric so that the next stitch starts after a little space. And you would just keep going in that pattern. So I'm going to do a few of these so you can see what the running stitch pattern looks like. You can also vary the length of your stitches to get different patterns. In the end, your running stitches should look something like that. To knot the back of your stitches when you're finished, you would just work your needle underneath one of your previous stitches on the back of your embroidery. Make sure you're going underneath your stitch and not through the actual fabric. And you just do that a few times. If you like, you can make a knot by going underneath a stitch and then through the hole that your thread makes, like this. After that, you can just trim the excess thread. And you're ready to move on to a different color or to a different spot on your embroidery. The second stitch I'm going to show you is the back stitch. For this, we're going to move on to a blue thread. And I'm going to end up using 4 threads just to make a thicker line. For the back stitch, I'm going to go along this line. The back stitch starts off just like the running stitch, where you start at one end, and pull your thread all the way through, then go down through the fabric, and here I've made one stitch. Then you're going to skip over and give yourself a little bit of space so that your needle comes up like this. The reason they call it a back stitch is because instead of going forward and poking the needle back down like you would for the running stitch, you go back to the point where your last stitch ended and poke your needle down in that spot. so that your two stitches are close together like that. This is a really good stitch for making a continuous line. You can see that I've kind of done that with this yellow thread here. Or it's good for making a solid line, doing borders around different elements of embroidery. The running stitch is good for filling up different spaces with texture or for doing more delicate lines. I'm going to do a few more stitches so you can see what the finished stitch looks like. As you can see, that is the running stitch, so now I have this solid blue line. The final stitch I'm going to show you is the satin stitch. So for this stitch, I'm going to use a single thread of embroidery floss because I want it to be kind of fine. The satin stitch is good for filling in areas, so once you have made some shapes on your embroidery design with the running stitch and the back stitch and made kind of an outline, you can use the satin stitch to fill that shape in so that you get a nice solid block of color. I'm going to be using it on a smaller area, but you can make these stitches as long as you need to so that you can fill out any length of space that you want. They don't have to be small stitches. The stitches can be a few inches long, but I'm going to take one strand of embroidery thread and poke it through the needle here. And this time I'm actually going to bring the two ends of the thread together. And tie a knot using both ends. So now I have this pretty thin line to work with. A satin stitch and a running stitch are basically the same, except with a satin stitch, you want these stitches to be parallel to each other and right next to each other so that they're close together so it looks like a solid shape. So I'm going to start by poking my needle through this fabric and doing one stitch. And then I just come up over and over again right next to that same stitch. Go back this way. So that this line keeps getting thicker until I get a square shape. If an area seems thin, it's okay. You can just keep going over it with the thread and fill those stitches in. As you can see, I've filled in that little square with some red thread. I've also filled in a little square with gold thread. You can keep going for as long as you want until you fill in the entire area that you want to cover with a certain color. So those are some basic stitches to get you started with your own embroidery designs. Feel free to draw your own and stitch them. And if you liked this video and you wanted to show us what you were working on, feel free to post it on Instagram and tag it with #FountaindaleLib. If you want to see more Teen Crafternoon videos, go to fountaindale.org/teencrafternoon.